Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui, coming to you live from Beijing. Death tolls have risen to more than 8,000 following the devastating 8.1 magnitude earthquake that hit Nepal 2 weeks ago, with reports still coming in after the 2 further earthquakes that hit the area in the past 24 hours. As the country begins the enormous task of reconstruction in China, we are today honoring the 7th anniversary of a deadly 7.9 magnitude earthquake that struck Sichuan province in 2008, leaving over 69,000 dead. What lessons might be learned from the experiences of both Nepal and China? How might China's own experiences impact its ability to assist Nepal in current reconstruction efforts, and what is the extent of China's involvement in those efforts? To discuss these issues, we are joined in the studio by Victor Gaojikai, Director of the China National Association for International Studies, and Lawrence Brown, founder of the Himalaya Consensus Institute. But before we start the interview, let's have a look at this.
On Tuesday, a 7.5 magnitude earthquake hit Nepal again, followed by a 6.2 magnitude aftershock. As of Monday, over 8,000 people had been killed and more than 17,000 injured, according to the Nepalese government. Now the major challenge is post-quake disease prevention. China has been expending great effort to help Nepal cope with the aftermath. This jointly constructed medical laboratory in Kathmandu is one of the major projects that China has provided. Chinese and Nepalese medical workers have been cooperating to assess health risk levels in the city over the past few weeks.
So far, we've examined 194 samples of pathogenic microorganisms and drinking water in Kathmandu, and we've found that there's a potential disease risk.
The Chinese medical workers are also providing training for their Nepalese counterparts. A disease surveillance and prevention course, jointly organized by China and Nepal, concluded on Monday. 34 Nepalese military medical trainees have been learning skills to better cope with post-quake emergencies.
So the Chinese team have been helping us, and we have the same methods for culture, but for water culture they have a better method which is faster but needs an extra equipment which is not available with us at now, this present time. So maybe in the future, if we have the same equipment, we can also work like the Chinese team.
Since the earthquake, 5 national medical teams and over 10 non-governmental teams from China have been working on the frontier to save lives. They were the first of the international rescue teams to save a life from the ruins, and have so far treated over 1,400 injured. The Chinese army has also carried out the largest overseas humanitarian operation in peacetime.
Now, what can you tell us about the current status of the rescue and aid in Nepal?
Right now the situation is that the status of rescue, search and rescue that was 2 weeks ago has already been reduced because that phase is gone and many of the international teams have already left. So now with the shock today of 7.5, the question is it going to be redeclared a search and rescue operation to bring those teams back in? The particular areas that are most struck by this is the Namche Bazaar, which is really the base camp of Everest area, and also Sinpal Chuk, which is a hill tribe rural area. And China currently has a team that's still on the ground. I think what's very important in the report that was just given is the capacity building effort, because it's not only coming in to search and rescue, but it's building the capacity of the Nepalese teams, because those teams are the best to get into the hill areas, and often that involves trekking. There's no way to bring vehicles in, and so the Chinese health and medical teams are concentrated now. There's at least a concentration in Kavri area, and that's very near jumping off point to the hill areas and Sinpal Chuk. So this, I think, is very key, is to quickly enhance the capabilities of the Nepalese grassroots medical NGO groups and the military, because they can get into these areas very quickly. And this is where China's experience is so valuable.
What do you think of the severity of the current situation after the aftershocks struck yet another, quite a few other areas? What do you think of the follow-up actions that need to be taken? Because the Prime Minister has just called for the overseas rescue efforts and teams to be abandoned and they can head back home.
Well, most likely the two shocks which took place very recently are the aftershocks after the 8.1 major earthquake hitting Nepal a couple of weeks ago, and it is to be expected that more aftershocks may actually happen. So I think a great alertness need to be established, and no one should let down guard. Secondly, I would say the Nepal situation is very, very difficult, partially because of the very special terrain and lack of infrastructure. Even in the best circumstances, for example, roads are very narrow, and most of the houses are scattered around on the slopes of the mountain. And in many places, altitude is a major hurdle, and many roads may have been destroyed. And also, most of the houses in Nepal are 2 or 3 stories high, but mostly they were built of with a timber. So on the positive side, no single collapse of a building might have hurt too many people. But on the other side, it is very difficult to do the search and rescue mission because most of the houses are very much scattered around. And it's difficult to mobilize resources and deploy them in a very effective manner to those remote places. And also I would say that the difference in temperature in the daytime versus at night in Nepal is very, very extreme. Therefore, I think how to deliver food, drinking water, medical assistance, but also, tents, blankets, etc., all these essentials to the people hit. And it is also time to really start to worry about the outbreak of epidemic, for example. And also the Nepalese people are very religious, and many of the religious shrines, temples, etc., have been damaged or even destroyed in the earthquake. So it is not only bodily harm and injury inflicted on the Nepalese people, but also in a very acute way, spiritual infliction, pains and sufferings to the Nepalese psyche. So I think a lot of work needs to be done. I agree that international assistance is very much demanded for. For a country like Nepal, the government is not in a position to handle an earthquake like this magnitude and many aftershocks which have happened and may still happen. International assistance is the key.
The account of Lawrence and your description immediately take us back to what happened 7 years ago in Wenchuan. Half of the population disappeared in Beichuan, for example, and the former General Secretary of the CPC Central Committee, Mr. Hu Jintao, recently paid a visit to Beichuan, and in fact the ruins in Beichuan are maintained as memorial to the heavy loss of the lives there. What inspirations can we draw to better prepare the Chinese rescue teams in Nepal to assist with the local authorities?
I think first of all they've accumulated experience, because when the Wenchuan earthquake struck, it took China off guard. And in the initial stages, it was really quite a challenge to be able to respond to that. Following that experience, again in 2010, there was another earthquake of disastrous proportion in Yushu in Qinghai. And again, it was the experience of Wenchuan which allowed to have some response to that more effectively than would have otherwise been the case. There was also the religious community, the Buddhist community. The monks came out and did so much at that time in terms of burying bodies and responding to this, which is similar to the situation in Nepal. But now, with this accumulated experience, I think that's very critical points are, first of all, helicopters. The Chinese helicopters can fly at high altitude. They have pilots who are experienced with this. So far, 3 helicopters have been in operation in Nepal, have been able to do search and rescue. There's another dimension to this now. More helicopters are needed for particularly transport, because a critical issue now is to transport the medical teams into some of the very remote areas from which they can even go to more remote areas, because so much of the damage now is actually in the hill areas where 90% of the housing has gone down and where accessibility to medical care is as Mr. Gao was just explaining, very, very difficult because of the road systems are almost non-existent, in some cases trail systems. So this is critical. There's one other area that's very, very important. There's 2 road systems that run from China's Tibet Autonomous Region to Nepal, and both of these road systems have been broken. And within this 2 weeks, both road systems have had efforts to be rebuilt. But the problem is now with the shock today, those roads are again broken, and broken even more severely. So one of the areas where China can really come in very effectively will be to reconstruct those roads. This is something that's very urgent because right now the monsoon season is arriving in Nepal, and north of the Himalayas we enter the rainy season from June onwards, which makes it very difficult. This is critical because these are 2 supply lines which are desperately needed, and China and Nepal have an agreement for mobile hospitals that can actually be transported, but they have to be transported by road. And so this is an area where China's ability to respond to construction quickly, particularly in this very adverse terrain, is so relevant, more so than probably any other country at this moment.
Victor, it seems whatever we do, we cannot live up to the demands there, since the vicissitudes of the Mother Nature is so brutal. All the repaired roads were destroyed again with the aftershocks. What can be done to cope with the adversity?
Well, of course, while there is great urgency in doing so many things for the people afflicted with this earthquake in Nepal, because today is the 7th anniversary of the major earthquake in Wenchuan, also allow me to pause a moment and express our condolences once again to all those victims killed in the Wenchuan earthquake. And I still remember very vividly the many, many hours of the live broadcast and interview we did together during those very painful days. And I would say if China benefited at all from the earthquake in Wenchuan, that is, we are more prepared against a major disaster like that. We paid very, very dearly and costly for the lessons that now we have learned. First of all, there should be pre-preparedness, the alertness, and also I think there should be regular inspections of the buildings and the houses to make sure that they may survive the earthquake. But also, more urgently, I think the disaster relief and the rescue missions, etc., they need to be highly, highly coordinated, and they cannot be left to themselves once the earthquake strike. There should be action plans laid out way before any outbreak of any major earthquake. So preparedness is the key.
Lawrence, what do you think of the massive situation there in Nepal that may have taken place most probably without a better coordination? For example, many non-governmental affiliated individuals and groups also traveled from China to Nepal, to say nothing of similar things that may have happened between India and Nepal. So what would you do to advise those NGO groups or individuals?
First message is you need coordinated response. This is also the message I'm hearing from the Nepal government. They want coordinated response that involves not just coming in and giving blankets or giving tents.
Would they travel there without a visa?
You can get a visa. Most countries can get a visa on arrival, and I think that the government has been quite positive now in opening up, for instance, channels for the transfer of funds to NGOs. This is open. Before there were taxes on transfers. They have also opened up in terms of allowing personnel in, but after the search and rescue, the foreign personnel need to go back, and what is needed is capacity building for locals. Locals are the local NGOs are the unsung heroes. Of course, media always looks at each national group that's there, but there's so much that's being done locally, which is very, very critical. And right now, just to look at the urban area, Kathmandu, for instance, one of the key shocks is psychological, because people have just moved off of the streets, they've moved back to their homes, now there's another earthquake and they're outside. And this is an area where China's technical assistance is desperately needed, because they need engineers who can go in and tell you whether this building is safe or not, and they don't have the skills for that. But the Chinese, even the universities, from the Wenchuan earthquake onwards, developed those skills, and a lot of it came from the Chinese universities and institutes, where they actually have electronic devices where they can go in and say, look, this building is not safe, or this building can be reinforced. And right now, simply being able to say, that building can be used, that building can't, is the kind of decisions that are needed on the ground where China can provide that skills. And I think in terms of, rather than NGOs running in, I think China's universities and these, if they can work together with a coordinated response through the Chinese Nepal government and send engineers to the ground right now, that is needed very badly. A second area which is needed for the coordinated response is logistics. Moving goods, moving tents and tarps from one place to another is not easy. And it's the experience of mobilizing and moving logistically where you almost have it's a professional skill set, and those people are needed as well as the medical
Okay, thank you very much.
technicians.
I'll get back to you in a few minutes. You're watching Dialogue with Lawrence Bram and Victor Gaujika. We're discussing consequences arising from the aftershocks that wreaked havoc with Nepal at the foot of Himalaya, and we're also commemorating the 7th anniversary of Wenchuan earthquake that killed 70,000 and still another 17,000 still missing. We're get back to you in a few minutes. Stay with us. Welcome back. Given the hindsight wisdom in the reconstruction of Wenchuan, which was destroyed 7 years ago exactly, how might the earthquake affect Nepal's long-term development? Let me give you a bit of the background information. The total economic cost of reconstruction in Nepal could top $5 billion according to an early estimate from IHS. The U.S. Geological Survey said the damage costs would most likely fall between $1 billion and $10 billion, but it could range much higher. Data from the group of analysts suggests that the Nepal disaster has set back the nation's economy for years to come. How do you assess the long-term consequences?
This is the time for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to come into Nepal, because first of all, it's the kind of experience that is collective experience in Asia and China, situations like reconstructing Wenchuan, where there has to be earthquake-proof construction that involves a technique with steel reinforcement that there has, again, a collective experience, and the financing of that and implementation is something which is part of the Chinese experience, part of the Asian experience, where the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank can respond to this in a far more effective way. Particularly since this bank has now been established, it's a great opportunity for it to move forward.
Perhaps it's also another case study for ADB, Asia Development Bank, and IMF. It's not just the AIIB. It's a considered effort by all of the international society. Victor?
I would say the long-term consequence on Nepal's economy will be very, very serious. Why? Mainly because Nepal is highly agricultural and animal husbandry driven economy, and the main economic pillar actually is tourism. So with many houses in ruins, major scenic spots, religious temples, sanctuaries, etc., damaged and destroyed, it will be a big drag on the tourism industry. And also I think for this year in particular, the agricultural output probably will be very, very much reduced, and the government is not very richly endowed in terms of financial resources to start with, and now they had to really scramble and find money to support the normal economic development, but then also allocate a lot of resources, probably way beyond what they can afford, on the reconstruction and also rebuilding up the country for restarting and jump-starting the tourism industry. Now, on the other hand, I would say, people in Nepal can either rebuild the houses as they were built before, which now, has proven to be very dangerous in earthquake times, or they need to really plan in a very, very different way, and also introduce the new model of building the new communities, for example. And that takes time. And I don't think there is indigenous technologies and know-how inside Nepal. And I think, as Lawrence mentioned, they really need to rely on international assistance, because you are talking about rebuilding many villages in new types of buildings. And also I would say while the top priority is saving lives right now, preventing the outbreak of the epidemic, etc. But sooner or later, all those damaged and destroyed religious relics, cultural centers, the monasteries, the temples, etc., need to also be put onto the center of the attention, because after all, the Nepalese people are highly religious, and the religious establishments are very much of the legacy of their civilization.
Yes, indeed.
One of the things,
many families have been traumatized.
Yes.
Rehabilitation programs should be provided to assist with the victims. Now, Madam Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, currently head of UNDP, says China deserves credit for the immediate rescue and reconstruction efforts. After all, we are the second biggest economy. But India is a strong leader of South Asia and an immediate neighbor of Nepal. What is India done to help with their neighboring country of Nepal?
Well, India's response has also been very quick, and India was one of the first to get planes in and get rescue teams in. And of course, they have a very deep historic understanding of the situation in Nepal. And so I think that their response has also been very quick, and also financially they have responded. Certainly, these are the two neighbors which have come to Nepal's aid at this time faster than anybody else. But I think one of the things I want to just pick up on was what Mr. Gao just said, and that is the entire, very similar to the Wenchuan earthquake, that was a period also of rebuilding and rekindling of spirit of the Chinese people. And the Nepal people are very resilient. And there's been a phrase that my colleagues in Nepal have told me has become very popular. It's called Nepal Rising. And it's about rebuilding the country. And in the traditional Hindu-Buddhist way of thinking, there's a Brahma-Shiva relationship. Whenever you have destruction, it means it's a time for creation. And those two things are actually in a yin-yang type of synchronism. And so there's a very strong feeling that it is a time for creation, and for the government, it's a time of actually all of these disputes, from the insurgency on, the inability to come to a conclusion of a constitution. There is now a new understanding of the need to have coalition and to have a government that can guide and can put in place the infrastructure, because it's international aid is about finance, it's about technology, but it's up to the Nepalese people themselves to drive forward and to rebuild their economy. And they do have the skills, particularly on the temples, the crafts. This is an opportunity to reinvigorate the economy again, as many craftspeople will be put to work to rebuild these temples in the traditional ways. And there's another aspect of Chinese technology which we haven't thought of, and that's traditional technology, meaning that actually you have, for instance, the Bamboo Association here in China, in Sichuan. This is a material which is very resilient. And in the villages, a lot of the construction has been new cement, which has collapsed. But if you're using the traditional material like bamboo in a traditional way as the support for buildings, it has a resilience. And this is where this technology, which is a traditional technology reinvigorated in Sichuan, can actually be applied to Nepal, which also has a natural resource of bamboo. It's just an example of the local knowledge being so applicable.
If I may add one point, I think, and I hope one positive thing out of this great disaster in Nepal is that people now become more aware of the importance of infrastructure. And Nepal being landlocked in between China to its north and India to its south, I think both China and India should work together to help building up the infrastructure in Nepal, and also eventually to make this big infrastructure connectivity between China to Nepal and from Nepal to India. Now this probably will be one of the major positive outcome of this big tragedy. If China, Nepal and India can get their hands together and get their acts together, I hope out of the great destruction there will be a new Nepal, well connected with major, strong, reliable infrastructure to its south with India and to its north with China.
To oversee the rebirth, the reincarnation and reconstruction of a new Nepal, do you think it's necessary for the United Nations to host an emergency session of this international body, very much like the one that was held to discuss reconstruction in the war-torn country of Afghanistan? What do you think of the united international efforts one that should be put together by UNDP and other departments of the United Nations?
Let's look at it on two levels. One is you can convene an international meeting like this. The United Nations has already raised, I think, $415 million for Nepal aid, but where will that money be used? Will that money go to Nepal, or will that be spent on executive perks living in New York City, which is often what happens with the United Nations? I'm going to come to a more relevant issue, and that is the climate change fight. We have now the UN meeting in Paris coming up. There's been no solution, and the earthquake in Nepal and the earthquake in Wenchuan and in Yushu are all connected to not just climate change, but climate disruption. That is the word we should be using. It's not about change, it's about disruption. As the carbon emissions go up, and Nepal is surrounded by China, the largest carbon producer in the world. The third largest is India. America is the second largest. If these three countries cannot get their act together to reduce carbon, the glaciers will melt. And remember, rock is leveraged by water. So one of the big problems that we face in the Himalayan region right now we call GLOFs, which are glacial lake overflooding. And what suddenly you have the ice caps gone. That water is being kept in lakes and behind rock that cannot support it, and something has to give. And that is definitely a factor behind these earthquakes. And it's the same shock that took place in Yushu, the same shock in Wenchuan is affecting Nepal, and also there have been tremors these past few days also in the Tibet Autonomous Region of China.
It seems we are living in a period of a seismologically prone period, and we got to be better prepared.
This is the big issue, and this is the long-term solution that has to be addressed. Otherwise, the earthquakes are going to continue, as well as other natural disasters.
Other than the follow-up actions to be taken by the United Nations and the important neighboring countries like India and China, what do you think of the spirit of resilience itself? In the year 2008, exactly 7 years ago, despite the devastation of Wenchuan, we successfully hosted the 2008 Olympic Games. And a lot of world leaders praised China for its enormous, unbelievable organizational capability and the spirit of resilience. Right? What do you make of the Nepalese resilience?
I have great trust and confidence in the resilience of the Nepalese people.
Self-salvation should first and foremost be the top priority on the agenda.
After all, they are one of the most resilient and toughest ethnic groups in the world, and they have legends and track records to back it up. But I would say I would like to use this opportunity to appeal for a new model of international disaster relief assistance. Purely relying on the existing international organizations may not be sufficient. We, mankind, need to think of a better way, more efficient way, faster deployment, and bring disaster relief to the people in the disaster zones.
Thank you very much. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. We are here to commemorate the 7th anniversary of the Wenchuan earthquake, as well as pay tribute to those who were killed by the devastating earthquake in Nepal. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.